very explicit about how he wants to use the Bureau. We know exactly what a weaponized FBI looks like. It looks like what J. Edgar Hoover perfected in his later years. It abused the civil liberties and civil rights of ordinary Americans. It punished political enemies. It persecuted political opponents.
There's a lot to talk about. Let's bring in our nightcap guest, former New York prosecutor and civil rights attorney Charles Coleman Jr. Dan Nathan is here, co-founder of Risk Reversal, CNBC contributor and host of the On the Tape podcast. Basil Smikle joins us, Democratic strategist and former executive director of the New York State Democratic Party. He is now an MSNBC political analyst and Columbia University professor. And look who's in town. Jacob Soboroff, political and national correspondent for NBC News. But he's here for a very special reason tonight. He's the executive producer of the new MSNBC film Separated, which is based on his best-selling book. It looks into Trump's family separation policies during his last administration. You could catch it on MSNBC this Saturday at 9 p.m. Eastern. I am so glad you're here. But Basil, I turn to you first. Pete Hegseth. He would not answer questions today about NBC News reporting that Fox News colleagues, employees, as many as 10, were concerned about his drinking, a guy who anchors a morning TV show. And now you've got 6 Republicans who are saying they're not necessarily on board with this guy.
Yeah. Nomination's in trouble, in my view. And look, I saw a non-active Marine shortly after this name was mentioned. He recognized me, knows what I do. He said, man, I don't understand why this guy would be chosen, because he hates women so much, that there are so many rank and file women and folks of color in the military that are not going to move beyond a certain point. There's going to be so much, there's going to be such low morale with him leading that this is going to be a huge problem. And as much as Donald Trump loves to complain about the generals, the one thing the generals can't have happen is losing the morale of the rank and file of the soldiers. And if that happens, and if you start to see that bubble up, which I imagine it already is, and you have senators who are saying, look, we're with you until we're not with you, right? That if you can't cause us problems because we're the only ones that, you know, sort of come between you and the people. That's when you're going to see some real challenges, and that's why I don't think this nomination stands.
Whether it's Hegseth or Kash Patel, when you hear things that, like, even moderate Republicans aren't pushing back, or they're saying, let's see how this goes, does that say that they're going to clear these guys and let them sail through, or are they going to let the process play out, have these FBI hopeful background checks, and not stick their necks out and get in a fight with Trump yet?
You and I share a former employer, Mayor Michael Bloomberg, I don't remember the number,
We're going to talk
the
about
mayor
him
of the great city of New York. And he told me when I was an advance man to him, if you don't know the answer, he said, Jake, number 1, don't F it up. Number 2, say, I don't know. And the answer to the question is, I don't know. I don't envy the position that my colleagues, our colleagues on Capitol Hill are in, chasing these folks around the halls of Congress every single day. But what does feel like to me is someone who has watched as a reporter from the ground, and I will talk about it later, this administration, the first time around, flood the zone with policies that I think, you know, when it comes to family separation, first and foremost is my expertise. I think the universe decided that that was morally reprehensible. They do everything they possibly can to distract in as many ways as possible to push through whatever these top priorities are. We know what their number 1 priority is, mass deportation on the first day here. And so when I watch people chasing these folks around Congress, I don't know who's going to stay and who's going to go, but I know what they're ultimately trying to do at the end of the day, on day 1, when they walk through the door. The largest mass deportation program in American history, and look what we're all here sitting talking about.
All right, from a legal perspective, when you look at all of Trump's appointments right now, what concerns you the most? When you look at these names, when you read their bios, when you know who they are?
Stephanie, I'm very concerned about their understanding of how government actually works, because they, in my opinion, are setting up the entire United States for a multitude of constitutional crises by trying to do things, enact policy, and then enforce policy that, quite frankly, is not constitutional. But I have a bigger question as I look at all of these nominations and the trouble that they are having. For Republicans, you got what you wanted. This is the guy that you wanted in office, and that is fine. That is how a democratic process works. But what was your plan? What was the plan once you got what you wanted? Because now that this guy is doing, and when I refer to this guy, I'm talking about Donald Trump, is doing predictably what Donald Trump does. What is your answer for this? If you're not going to be able to get these appointments confirmed, then what happens to government? How does it stall? How does it do what it's supposed to do? The answer is that it doesn't. And that is a very scary reality, whether you're talking about in the courts or whether you're talking about in the legislature. It's a huge problem, and it's something that lawyers like myself are scratching our heads about because we don't know what's coming, but we know it's not good.
I think it comes down to mandate and political capital, right? So how broad is this mandate that Trump just achieved in this election, right? And so when you think about these nominations, it's actually far less broad than he would have you believe. If you look at the popular vote, you look at the narrow lead that they have in the House, right? And then you think about what sort of political capital are they willing to risk to get probably a dozen sort of nominations that just don't make a whole heck of a lot of sense. So does it come down to politics over policy? Because to your point, Charles, there is no really policy agenda when you look at a lot of these folks that they've nominated. So to me, I just think that when it comes down to it, I think we're going to see a lot of the sort of thing that we saw in 2017. I think they're going to actually see some of these nominations obviously fall by the wayside.
Okay, but isn't there something slightly absurd? Donald Trump clearly won the election, right? It was a clean sweep for the GOP, but it wasn't a landslide. But what we heard over and over is people were furious about the economy, inflation. The economy is steadily doing better and better and better, so people aren't going to be so upset. But these picks don't reflect sort of the centrist tone of the country.
Yeah, and on the inflation, right? So if that was the number one issue, I mean, when you think about a lot of the policies, and we've talked about this, when you talk about tariffs, when you talk about tax cuts, I mean, that's going to be massively inflationary. So if you think about, they're going to be bogged down in a whole bunch of political stuff, trying to kind of get some of these sort of like stick in the eye sort of things to kind of own the libs. And we went through this in 17, 18, and 19. Well, when we get to the midterms, and we're going to start really focusing on the midterms in probably about a year or so. And if inflation doesn't come down, and some of the measures that we look at when it, as it relates to inflation are not going much lower here, right? So he's going to have a very contentious relationship with the Federal Reserve chair, okay? And he's the one who sets the rate policy, right? And so if we see inflation get really sticky, which we might do, I mean, it's going to be a wipeout, I think, in the midterms. At least as far as the House is concerned, they probably won't make up a whole heck of a lot. And that sticks government right there.
Well, no, but that's to both of your points. It's really important and worth noting. Presidents often feel they have a mandate when they don't. And I think particularly with this administration, this incoming administration, they're going to find that their coalition, whatever that was, is going to be rather tenuous. And what's concerning for, I think, the administration, and what we would want to watch, is that you, on the one hand, have Trump, who wants to put in a lot of his loyalists to be able to do this work.
Extreme loyalists.
But you also have folks like the Heritage Foundation, who actually want to execute Project 2025 in 180 days. So if you have people who are kind of focused on the policy, as much as I wouldn't like that policy, but they're focused on that policy, and you have Trump that really just wants the loyalists and the attention and the fame, that to me, and to Charles's point, is that you're going to have a lot of sort of chaos and conflict, and I do wonder if anything actually does get done, because you're just going to have this sort of tension constantly.
You spent much of the last year talking to real voters in states across this country. Do you think those voters that you sat with, that you spoke to, are they paying attention to these cabinet picks?
You know what I was thinking about as I was listening to you guys? The people that I met who work on the cherry tree farm in Door County, Wisconsin, the elderly people in Maricopa County, Arizona, who have literally have so little money that they had to rely on charities to get air conditioning installed in their homes, so they wouldn't pass away. People in Aliquippa, Pennsylvania, in Western Pennsylvania, who, when the steel industry collapsed, literally had nothing, and now look to each other on their football team for their sense of community, pray that the life that they used to have would come back. How long are they willing to listen to this, to the conversations that we're having before they say, enough's enough with this. I'm ready for change yet again. And they look for somebody else to come in and represent them. I think that the time limit is very, very short. I think people feel very exhausted by all this. I think they were looking for something different, and I don't know how, I think the clock is ticking, I guess is what I would say.
Can we go to Matt Gaetz for a second? Yes, his nomination was pulled, but that ethics report still hasn't come out. there are some Democrats pushing to make sure it does, because what could happen is Matt Gaetz kind of files into the recesses, does something for Trump and part of the team, who knows what, and then he pops up in a year and a half and runs for governor of Florida. What's the likelihood we see this ethics report?
I thought we would have seen more activity from the Senate recently, because early on you had Senator Cornyn saying, you know what, I kind of would like to see this report while Gaetz was still sort of in the mix. And it was some glimmer of hope that the senators, because there are a lot of them up in 2026, that want to protect themselves, if not just protect Donald Trump. They say they want to protect Donald Trump, but honestly, they've got their own campaigns to be worried about. So I thought that moment was really an important moment to say, yeah, let's get this out here. Now that, he's no longer being considered, I don't know if there's going to be that momentum to actually put anything out.
I tend to agree in the sense that what utility does Matt Gaetz, even as a governor, have for the Republican Party, such that their responsibility continues to protect him or keep him or shield him from that report coming out. At this point,
if he becomes governor of Florida, Florida remains super important to Donald Trump. He's going to go back there in 2028, and he wants his boy as the governor next time around.
Sure, but Florida's also not, right now at least, in danger of not having a Republican governor sit at that seat. And so, regardless
but there's a John Cornyn flavored Republican, and there's a Matt Gaetz flavored Republican.
I do understand that, and I think that depending on what we've been talking about in terms of how embattled Donald Trump is and how quickly he becomes embattled, that could play more of a factor. But I also would not underestimate the emergence of another Republican, a stronger candidate than Matt Gaetz, being someone who becomes a favorite to keep that state red as far as the governorship is concerned, without having to resort to Matt Gaetz. So I don't necessarily see that protection lasting, especially around this ethics report that everyone's been talking about for much longer.
I'm sorry, but it goes to your point about political capital. How much is Donald Trump really willing to spend on Matt Gaetz at the end of the day? And my guess is not much. Not much.
He's not willing to spend political capital on anyone but himself, and it's worked for him. Before we go to break, I want to ask you sort of about Kash Patel for a second, because obviously so much news over the last 2 days about President Biden choosing to pardon his son Hunter. Obviously, he changed his mind. He went back on his word and said, I'm going to pardon my son. Could part of the decision-making process have been Donald Trump is choosing extremists in this administration, people like Kash Patel, right, who believe in the deep state, who push conspiracy theories, who, if they are in these top positions of power, couldn't just make sure Hunter Biden, serves his time, faces his consequences, but could end up in a living hell. Could that have been a factor here?
Listen, unquestionably, two things can be true. And I do absolutely think that this was a preemptive protective measure by President Biden with regard to his son to avoid the most extreme of consequences that would have been political, that would have been politicized with respect to how Hunter Biden would have been symbolically treated because of who he is and who he's connected to. There's no question there. I also think that at the same time that move was made, that it does do a bit to stain the decision-making process in terms of how President Biden went about this and when he went about it in particular, because Hunter Biden hadn't been sentenced yet. And I think that also plays a role into what preemptive strike, if you will, President Biden took in protecting Hunter by the pardon. So both of these things exist, but you're absolutely right. I absolutely believe that this was something that he did, understanding what the writing on the wall said and knowing that this was something that he could do something about, and he chose to.
Nuance and two opposing thoughts being true at the same time.
Imagine.
That actually happens in America. All right, everybody is sticking around for the entire hour, but before we go to break, I want to share an update on the situation in South Korea. You've been hearing about it all day going, what? Well, yeah, the crucial American ally is facing a political